Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Chalk Talk and our last episode before we take a little summer break as everybody heads off to summer, whether they're training or just click and reset after what's certainly been quite the school year. We are going to dive into talking about conditioning today, building off of a lot of the conversations we've been having over the last few podcasts actually, so we're excited to kick this one off. A friendly reminder, no matter where you get your podcast, you can always kind of recycle back if you've missed a few and want to catch up over the summer. But let's go ahead and get this one started. This is Chalk Talk, presented by Platform. Let's go. All right, as I mentioned, this is our last episode before our summer break, and what better topic to talk about as we head towards the summer in conditioning, one that has probably had more ebbs and flows in terms of when, why, what, and how on Twitter and on just every coach's kind of radar as we move along. We talked about speed and kind of change of direction last week at terms of like kind of high-end speed and everything along those lines. Today we're going to talk about conditioning. We've done this probably conversation in a lot of different ways around different energy systems and all sorts of things, but today we're really going to get into the kind of like meat and potatoes of the word conditioning and what that means when it comes to training. So I'll let you dive in, and as always, we'll kind of take the same flow of definitions, what, how, all those different pieces.
Yeah, no, it's a good conversation to have. As you said, it's apropos for the time of year, as most athletic programs will engage in some sort of conditioning protocol over the summer, and it's also highly kind of contentious on strength coach Twitter and in the industry in general right now. Just, for the sake of this conversation, I think it's worth framing that in a lot of circles now that there is really a debate between two camps. One that says that conditioning is a complete and utter waste of time. Anything that's not minimum dosed, high intensity, really speed training is just not something that it actually like goes against the development of an individual athlete. And then there's others, and I would actually say the overwhelming majority, but a more quiet group that utilizes work capacity training for the development of their athletes for really any sport. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that at every level across every sport, big time professionals down to our everyday high school coaches utilize conditioning in the sense of work capacity development and do so very successfully. I think there is probably a problem area in which some people use it incorrectly or don't quite get what they're hoping to out of it or work against goals elsewhere. But it is something that we all know is a useful piece of the puzzle. I think any coach that has coached any level of sport know some way, somehow they just feel that work capacity element, whether or not they can define it and reach towards it is a different question, but we feel it. Like every coach says we weren't in shape enough, or we won in the fourth quarter because of, like, we can all point to kind of the results of good work capacity training and development, but maybe where we diverge is just in our ability to do so in the best, most efficient and appropriate manner possible.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where we're going to dive in. But to your point, obviously, we want, like you mentioned, the word being in shape, and getting to being in shape, I think, is where we're going to talk about what we'll do from a conditioning word perspective, where some folks will picture just, hey, go run for 60 minutes and get in
Everybody
shape.
run 2 miles a day for the next 2 weeks.
Whatever it might be. So I think that's a good kind of setting post, especially for middle school, high school athletics, just in general, talking about, being in general shape is a good place to sort of look at it. But let's take the same approach we do with a lot of the other topics we pick and sort of just get a guiding definition of what we're talking about when we say conditioning.
Yeah, and right now for this conversation, when we talk conditioning, we're going to really talk about it the way that most people think of the word, which is the development of work capacity through traditionally running, although it obviously can apply in a lot of other elements like the pool or even rowing and whatnot. But the reason I say that is because technically speaking, speed training is conditioning, because you are conditioning your body to do something that it hadn't done previously. So there's another big kind of semantic argument people have, but I think we all understand when we talk about conditioning, it's the development of work capacity, the ability to do something at higher intensity for a longer period of time, whether that's low intensity for a long long periods of time, high intensity repeated efforts. We want to build that ability so that you can operate at your best for a long period of time. And I think it's really worth mentioning, resist undue fatigue, or resist fatigue as long as possible, not just because playing at your 100% is better than playing at your 80%, but because there are a million different pieces of research and data that would suggest that fatigue is the number one driver or cause of eventual injury to occur. So we want to be able to maintain high levels of output at whatever level that might be for our sport, and we also want to do so without risking injury because we are unprepared for the demand of sport.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of things that's pretty simple to think about. Like, hey, if I tasked you to do something once as an athlete, can you do it? Most likely, yes. But if I test you to do it a second or third time, does it all of a sudden just totally break down? Mm-hmm. And often that comes with, your just general, work capacity ability and how many times or how many repetitions or how long you can continue to work effectively, efficiently, and safely. So I think that's probably a good thought process to go into. How does it actually relate to sport itself in terms of kind of conditioning within the realm of athletics and sports? Is it conditioning for the whole picture, as in you can get conditioned by doing running, by doing workouts, by doing different types of things, or some conditioning comes from conditioning within the sport itself, like getting in playing shape?
Yeah, and this is where I want to be careful. I think you can look at conditioning two ways, and it's unique because of the audience that we work with, which is generally high school students, which are generally inexperienced students, which are generally developmental students, and they're also student athletes who play multiple sports. So when we talk conditioning, I want to be clear that there are really two routes. There is maybe the more specific use case, which is the easier one to kind of think about as a sports performance coach or an athletic coach or even an athlete, which is, I have a season coming up. There are specific demands of that sport. I need to be prepared for that so that I can get through practice, let alone perform well in a game. And that's something that we can all really understand. Like, I have 6 weeks to get ready for football. Like, how should I do so? But then I would argue that there is maybe a larger piece of the puzzle when it pertains to the audience we're talking about, which is you are going to be tasked with training maybe one group or maybe 10 groups of student athletes that are of all different ages that are playing sports throughout the year, and you're going to have to add some element of work capacity training into their off seasons, in seasons, so forth and so on, regardless. So there might be just a bigger umbrella of, are you developing baseline capabilities of the things we'll talk about, like aerobic capacity, anaerobic capacity, repeated sprint ability, which is kind of like a marriage of the two? Are you doing that year round so that it matches the rest of what they're doing? You can think of it as like in the gym versus on the field, because we don't always get that 6-week lead up to a season with one group focusing on one sport. Yeah. And I think both things are super important because, as you said, look, we're talking athletics quite a bit right now. But if you're training anybody, we know, like the in shape, the cardio element, the metabolic health element, like, you want to have a good aerobic base. You want to have a good anaerobic base. There's no reason not to have both of those things. So I think throughout the year, throughout their career, developing and building on those two things are important, regardless if you're going into a very specific season or not.
Gotcha. And I think that's a good segue into the two terms you just threw out there from, aerobic base, as well as anaerobic base, maybe aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity as well, in sort of thinking about those two pieces. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we've talked at length about these terms. We've gone into the weeds of the science of them when it comes to kind of like energy systems and all of those different pieces. But in the world of conditioning, we are really focusing on aerobic and anaerobic capacity and conditioning. So let's break those two down next, because I think that helps to kind of paint the picture of sort of the two buckets, if you will, of how we approach it.
Right. And to your point, I don't want to dive too far into the ways in which they work. I think more important is understanding that there are two, to call it three, kind of very specific energy system mechanisms that allow us to do those repeated activities, whether they're long and slow or high and fast. But I think more important is maybe how does the effect of an aerobic capacity base or the development thereof. Like, what is the impact on performance? What are we gaining?
Yep.
And you can think of aerobic capacity is, one, it's your body's ability to utilize oxygen at higher levels and greater efficiency. What that means in the most simple sense is your ability to clear waste products of higher intensity or even lower intensity efforts so that you can continue to go and you never hit, quote unquote, that wall.
Yeah.
And so, outside of endurance sports, which we know obviously it makes sense to have an aerobic base because that's your sport. But most team sports are closer to anaerobically inclined in a lot of their focal points. However, the way in which you can improve your anaerobic kind of ability and repeated ability is through a greater aerobic system, because it helps you clear byproducts and refresh those systems that are kind of like earlier in the line of intensity. So if you improve your aerobic base, it really serves two purposes. One, when it comes to high intensity action, your ability to recover from those things is better. And so anytime you can recover from something quicker and more complete, you're going to be better at repeating it, whether or not you've even practiced that, right? So aerobic base serves repeated sprintability in that sense, or repeated speed endurance, or whatever you want to call it. But secondarily, I would be remiss not to say this, I say it all the time, I think we often get a little too far down the rabbit hole of trying to identify highly specific performance demand within sport. What I mean by that is everybody says, well, the cliched example is a football play is 6 seconds and you get 35 seconds rest. Okay, I understand the argument. I played a lot of years of football at almost every level. I get it. However, they've done a lot of studies in hockey and football and everything else. Yes, between the whistles, you might operate at really high intensity in almost every sport. But over the course of a 2 and 3 hour competition, practice schedule over the course of weeks, you're going to travel many, many miles of low intensity duration movement. And no, I don't think that should be your priority, is to plan for that and make that your all-in performance goal. However, it does serve a purpose to be prepared for that volume and that intensity, at least to some degree, just like it is important to prepare for the things that are, quote unquote, in between the whistles.
Yeah, and I would say that cliche is in terms of, a fair one to use, and to kind of take that scope out one step further, is a lot of times we hear coaches say, or we see coaches say online or wherever talking with them, is, well, I just want to make sure that we maximize our time and hit the things that are most replicated to sport. We've talked about that mimicry aspect all the time without kind of filling in those missing pieces, like you said, of running off the field, on the field, subbing in and out. If you can't even do those motions because all you've done is focus so far in on that one specific skill that you can visually see, you might start to lose out on some of the other pieces.
And not to do mental backflips here, but we talked about it before in the world of, are you preparing over 6 weeks for a season, or are you doing this kind of just holistically over the course of a career and you're thinking about what I need to build? You could very much make the case that, hey, I don't really need to spend a ton of time on extensive aerobic training, because once we get into the sport, I ease them in and we build that up over the season. That's fine. However, that's not always the situation, and that's not always the situation that you, the coach that is training the athletes, are faced with. And sometimes you're the performance coach sending them to an athletic coach, and the athletic coach goes all in on day one. And if they're not ready because you only focused on one element of it, then they're in trouble. So I think always understanding that you have to take an objective look at what the perspective is for each of those athletes. Are we talking over a career? Are we talking over a very specific time frame or whatever? But I don't think anybody would argue, most people wouldn't argue, that a good aerobic metabolism is super important to sport performance for a lot of reasons. It's not the be-all, end-all, but it is important. And why I say it's not the be-all, end-all is I think what gets this debate kind of raging is how many people take it probably to an extreme where they're not just wasting time by spending many, many minutes to hours a week of long, slow, grinding conditioning. That also puts athletes in really undue fatigue states where you can risk injury. You're also not really gaining all that much because at a certain point you've focused only on one thing.
Yeah, and we'll get to how to train it, but I think that's a good point, is that a lot of times people think, or see, or we've gone so far one direction or the other of like, well, when we think conditioning, we think aerobic style conditioning, we think like long, slow distances under fatigue, or just repeated bouts for 2 hours, like nonstop without ever even touching a football or soccer ball or whatever it may be. And it's like that extreme. And you're going to get into it, so we won't jump ahead. But I think that's a good point, is like separating what we actually mean by that and how to train it. And we'll get to that. Before we do, let's just at least touch on the anaerobic. You talked about the aerobic at length there. Let's just at least make sure we kind of square out that other side of the coin, and then we'll get into training.
Yeah, and anaerobic is pretty simple. It's your ability to operate at high intensity, basically as high as you can for as long as you can, which is, in maybe more practical or whatever terms, it's your ability to resist or deal with those byproducts that hopefully aerobic is trying to clean out, but that can eventually stop you in your tracks. We all know if you went all out for a 400-meter run, by the end, you're just like, I can't go anymore. And what we can do is just build your buffer for how long you can operate at certain intensities before that kicks in. And why that's important, again, that's even still probably longer than somebody does one play or one very small part of like a soccer game or a baseball game, stealing a base. Yeah, sure, we're not really, working at super high intensity for super long periods of time. However, it all works backward down the chain as aerobic helps anaerobic. Anaerobic, if you operate on the higher end of anaerobic, which is that glycolytic side, you can actually improve how much of it you can use while even in shorter time domains, like that phosphocreatine system we talked about. Again, I know I'm kind of talking about things that we've already kind of jumped into detail back in the day. So if you need to go back and look at those, please do. But basically, if you improve aerobic, it helps everything underneath it. If you improve that glycolytic anaerobic, it improves everything underneath it. And what's underneath it is that bedrock of operating at 10 seconds, 100% ability. And then if you can do that with the help of the systems above it, you can do it longer because it's bearing less of the brunt. And so you have more in the tank. You have the ability to do so repeatedly because it can clear itself, replenish itself, and it's also being asked to do less over time. So long story short, that anaerobic capacity is also an important piece compared to the aerobic. And now we won't talk about it, but what you do in speed training has a conditioning element. That's why we want to make sure we're clear on semantics. You are improving your ability to go all out and recover. But these pieces feed into that so that the go all out and recover and maybe not recover fully adds up over time into what I would just call your repeated sprint ability, which is an easy way to think of anything in sport. Can you go out and sprint? Can you go out and do it again? And when we say sprint, we mean operate at 100%. I mean, an offensive lineman or anything in sport that's we're not talking about a 100-meter sprint, but you're huffing and puffing because you are going crazy against somebody or against yourself for 5 seconds. You might not move very far, but you're going crazy. Like that is what we mean by sprinting.
Yeah, and I think the repeated sprint and what you just described is helpful because you're sort of at that like right below or like kind of teetering and you have to do it over and over again. Like you're not, like you said, lining up for a 400-meter dash that you're doing once all out. You're lining up and having to kind of like be right near pretty maximal effort and be okay with it.
Get a little bit of break, you do it again.
Sure. So nice. And I think we've done, like you mentioned, talked at length there. So what we haven't talked at length about or really gotten into as much is talking about kind of training that work capacity. And, do me a favor by sort of defining each one within those two, aerobic or anaerobic, or how it kind of lines up. And again, painting the picture of when we're talking about those things, we're not necessarily just talking about like going for 2 straight hours or whatever it may be. Instead, you've got some terms and different kind of like training styles defined, and we'll dive into them from there.
Yeah, and it's pretty simple because the world of track and field has developed these approaches for a long time because they've had to train sprinters of varying distances, of varying needs, and so forth and so on. So there's just a lot out there that you can try. And then they've basically come up with 2 styles that I would say are something we've used for a long time, probably without naming it as such, as coaches and trainers, but tempo running. And so tempo running is really just the prescription of running at specific sets, reps, and percentages. So when we're no longer just saying it's at 100%, that's speed training, right? But we might say, hey, we want you at 95, 90, 85, 80, 75, 70 on any given set, rep, and so forth and so on. And then we adjust the distance, the rest you get after it, and maybe the approach of that particular rep for whatever the percentage is so that it matches up. And just like we do in the weight room, we can do that then with our running out on the field. When it comes to conditioning, tempo running is probably the best way to think of it, is the bridge between aerobic and anaerobic. So why I say that is everybody thinks aerobic training, as you said, is long, slow distance. That is part of the equation, and that certainly we can talk about, like, that's a viable tool at times even for team sport athletes. But when it comes to team sport athlete development, if you want to get the most effective use of your time, you build the most base and the most capacity, utilizing the least amount of time, and also probably creating the least amount of acute and cumulative fatigue, which obviously is an important part of training and resistance to injury and so forth and so on. Tempo running is probably the most effective way because you are so hyper specific on the reps, the sets, the intensities. It's extremely intentional. And there really are kind of two ways that we think of it, and most people do, which is extensive tempo running and intensive. So extensive, so extensive tempo running is more aerobically inclined. Comes from Charlie Francis, which is a name most people would recognize in the world of running, and how he trained sprinters and mid-sprinters and so forth and so on. And it is done with the intent of creating and engendering the adaptations that come with aerobic development, aerobic capacity development. And so what we're looking at is sub-maximal effort, 75, maybe 85% of your top speed performed at longer distances. We're not talking, mile, we're talking 80 yards, 80 meters, up to 200, maybe 300.
So just to kind of like flesh out what you mentioned earlier in terms of examples that have like specific sets, reps, intensities, what would fall under like the extensive tempo run formula there that like might fall into a workout that would fit that criteria?
Sure. You might say something like, very simple, 10 by 100 meter run at 75% speed performed on the 90 second, because you're going to be looking at something anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds of movement, and then you're getting about a minute of rest. So you're 2-to-1 work to rest, far more aerobically inclined. You're going to perform 10 reps, so you're covering 1,000 total meters or yards or whatever, but you're not doing it all at once in a row. And the reason that we do that is because, one, it allows us to prescribe the exact work to rest, so you get the exact intensity on every rep, so you're not going up, going down, and so forth and so on. But more importantly, you can then control your movement. And what I mean by that is, when we think of it, tempo running, everybody kind of wars on conditioning, because most often, as we say, it's the long, slow distance. When you go long, slow distance, most people, most athletes are going to, their form and technique is going to deteriorate from that sprint shape. And why that's important is because if you are running with something that is probably inefficient, borderline asking for injury over time because you've gotten lazy, and you've also trained yourself out of all of the speed development work that you have put in on the flip side. But this way we can actually work aerobically while not taking away from our sprint speed power development. If anything, we're actually probably bolstering it, because we can recover from it while still training the same movement mechanics and approach to running. So extensive, you might go up to 2,000 meters total in a session, but you're not going to do more than that. It's going to be built up over time, and you're probably never going to operate at anything more than 80, 85%. And the work to rest ratio is going to be in that 1-to-1 to 1-to-3 range. And it's intentionally submaximal. Like when I do it with my own athletes, like, please understand, you need to be operating at such a comfortable level that after the first rep, you know that you can do each of the next 9, 12, 15 at the exact same speed. Mm-hmm. I'm asking you not to sell out. I'm telling you, please don't go all out and beat the guy next to you. I want you to move really well at a pace that you think you can just keep hammering over and over again without ever getting to the point where you are struggling.
For sure. And that's a good kind of overview and example, because I think understanding like that type of stuff helps to kind of paint the picture of, which is hard, and this is where like it takes some discipline and also like almost over explaining to kids, like we're not looking for you to be necessarily racing, like, you know, and that's where often I think conditioning has fallen too. Like you're going to get from point A to point B as fast as you can, and then we'll do it again, we'll do it again, and we'll do it again.
It's just like in the gym. We're not always lifting our 100% squat. Sometimes we're down at 75, 80 and doing sets of 5 or 8 or whatever, and I'm saying, hey, I want you to move the exact same as your 100%. We're not going to change our squat form, but we're going to do something that I think you can do for a bunch more volume so that you build your work capacity through that lower intensity.
Yeah, and I like that comparison to the weight room in thinking about not always having to be like, you know, selling out or in that like absolute like cash out zone. Anything else when it comes to extensive tempo training that we should be mindful of, or is that a pretty good overview of what you wanted to tap on?
Yeah, no, I think that works.
Perfect. So now let's flip the switch. I'll kind of like throw it back at you in terms of intensive tempo running. Is it obviously starting to increase? You mentioned 70, 75, 80%, whatever it was when it came to extensive. Are we now increasing the percentage, decreasing distance? What kind of starts to line up when we use those same things of like the specific sets, reps, intensities? How does it change?
Yeah, both. I mean, you can think of it intensive as intense, right? And when we say intensity, we talk load or we talk relative to your maximal ability, the percentage at which you're operating. So intensive, we're near maximal or maximal ability or effort. But we're going to do it over a much shorter distance, you know, maybe up to 60 yards rather than like starting at 80 or 100 for our extensive and building up from there. Instead of building up in distance, what we'll do is we'll say, hey, we're going to operate at maximal ability. We're going to intentionally give you non-complete rest. What I mean by that is not, hey, I need you to be exhausted on every rep. What I'm saying is I'm going to set the reps, the distance, and the time spent in between such that it's not fully like an aerobic work to rest, 1 to 1, 1 to 3, but it's not like when we do speed development, we say you need to rest, 15 times as long as you work, but you're only, working for 5 seconds, so it's not that hard. You can do it on the minute. But we're going to intentionally not let you rest completely. So normally if you're sprinting at 100%, you need that, 15 time rest. We might say it's more like 8 or 10. We're intentionally not letting you rest completely because we are building that ability to, buffer yourself and resist the buildup of waste products over time. We're intentionally starting at a certain number of reps, saying let's complete that with those sets and reps and work to rest ratios. The next week, let's just do 2 more.
Yep.
And the next week, let's do 2 more. So instead of building distance and total volume of distance, we're talking total volume of just number of reps completed at that high percentage intensity.
Gotcha. And it's actually a perfect kind of question or follow-up to some of the things both in extensive and intensive. I asked the same thing when we were talking speed training last week in terms of like how often are we doing this? Like what's the conditioning like map look like? You just said we're adding reps each week or we're doing different things each week. Is this something, again, where I think sometimes we've gotten caught up? All of a sudden it's like go run, like you said earlier, like, just go run X amount each day.
Right.
Or like, yeah, just work this in so you build up that like capacity.
Yeah.
A little bit more strategy in this model. How often are you doing it and how does it kind of get cycled in?
Yeah, and again, I think there's no super specific right or wrong answer here, but what I would say is if you're doing it alongside speed development, because again, that's one element of conditioning that we just don't call conditioning, and then you do your intensive and you do your extensive. If you're doing those, 1 to 2 speed sessions and then 2 tempo sessions a week, so maybe it's you do your tempo running after 2 of your 4 workouts a week and you do your speed development before 2 of your 4 workouts a week. I think that is more than plenty. You could also certainly say for, we're months away, so we're going to do extensive work twice a week. And then as we get closer, we'll do extensive twice a week or intensive twice a week instead. But you don't need more than a couple a week. And also, if you think about it, it's not just about you don't need more than a couple a week. Like, where are you going to fit it?
Yeah.
You get a lot of other things that you want to take care of. And I think that's where, again, people fall into the trap, and why there's a war on conditioning is it's easy to prescribe conditioning. And so it's easy to fall in the trap of like just more is better, keep doing more. If it's one of the things that you want to improve, great, but you need to do it only as frequently as you did your lower body strength training, which might be once to twice a week, right? So I think following the same guidelines that you'd follow for anything in the gym, power development or speed development outside of the gym, 1 to 2 times a week is probably enough. And then you can always just make it slightly more frequent, 2 times a week, 3 times a week, as you get closer to a season, if you are looking to, quote unquote, get into the closest to maximum ability and preparedness that you want to be before the first day of preseason camp.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that then will kind of lead me to my next question along the lines of just thinking about like, all right, but certain days it's just like, I'm kind of banged up and I'm not feeling great, or I only have like limited equipment because of where I'm at or whatever it may be, or I'm just not feeling it. And sometimes I'll just go for a 20 to 30 minute low slow jog or bike or whatever it may be. Like, how does that all fit in? Does that
Well, yeah.
or is that almost separate because it's in the form of recovery or in the form of just like moving and grooving?
Well, I think just first and foremost, long, slow distance, which just has this weird connotation now in the sports performance world as like an evil thing, has its place. It's a tool for any coach in any toolbox, and it should always be considered as such. I mean, let's be real. Like, yes, it might be considered playing your sport, but if you're preparing athletes for cross country, like long, slow distance is going to need to play a role, even though they do intervals at greater, their version of tempo running is bigger and so forth and so on. But I'd argue that like for a lot of reasons, long, slow distance can be a tool, as you said, really good recovery mechanism, especially if it's low impact. So if you just hop on a bike, right? Because you're just not giving the wear and tear that comes with running while getting the kind of low level aerobic capacity development, and also just the recovery mechanisms that are kind of spurred by low level aerobic work. And by the way, let's not maybe forget that there is a certain mental benefit because of physiological things to just light activity performed maybe outside of the gym, maybe outside of quote unquote training, and maybe just outside of the rigors of high intensity, really structured flow type of work. And some people, some kids, some athletes, some adults might just really feel better if once a week they do something low, long, and slow, and there is nothing wrong with that. It doesn't just remove all of the gains that you've done on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think that's where the long, slow distance kind of back and forth, that's always kind of sparked my interest. Is it's in the same way of, well, so-and-so, name popular athlete, never runs more than blank miles, or so-and-so never does more than this. And I think it's like, okay, that makes a lot of sense, but they also have world-class trainers, they're a professional athlete, they're doing all sorts of other things. Like, just because that person doesn't do it doesn't mean that it's like, taboo and evil.
Right.
And I think that's where we get caught up sometimes, is like, insert athlete name has never run a 5K in their life. Like,
well, the only thing you got to remember is whatever you do most religiously. When I say religiously, it's like most consistently and most frequently. So if you run long, slow once every 2 weeks or once a week, you're not going to adapt to it all that strictly. If at the same time you're doing speed twice a week, in tempo running twice a week, like that's what your body is going to adapt most to. Mm-hmm. And so if your desire is speed and repeated sprint endurance, no, you shouldn't run 2 miles every day as conditioning, because you're not training for what your goal is.
Right.
But if you're just adding it in, it's totally fine. It's not going to just remove.
Yeah, and I think that's where too, like some of the bigger pieces and like arguments stem from as well, is like, making sure we're not like avoiding or losing out on like getting the best you can in the form of sprinting and everything else like that. But I think your point is well taken, especially as we head into summer. How many lifts are you trying to get done? How many speed trainings are you trying to get done? How many conditionings are you trying to get done? Are your kids also like off playing summer ball and being required to do other things and doing all sorts of other activities? Most likely, yes. Are they playing in a pickup basketball league? Like, all of that starts to accumulate that they're doing so much.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's where conditioning starts to you kind of stare at it and go, ooh, is it worth it? So
it's got to fit into the larger kind of bucket of whatever else is going on.
Yeah. So I guess as we steer towards wrapping up in terms of just thinking about like what's going to fit best for our team or our group of athletes or whoever we're working with, whether it's the summer, in school, out of school, let's kind of like break it down. What's your kind of stamp on this? What should we do in terms when it comes to thinking of conditioning as that topic that we've defined and talked about now?
Yeah, I think just remembering that it should be approached mentally the same way that you do everything else in the gym. And what I mean by that is you identify your goals, you identify the tools that can be utilized to develop athletes towards those goals. Then you take a look at what are your literal constraints, logistics, location, equipment, and then outside factors like how many things are kids doing outside of what you do. And look, if you just take all those variables, write them down, and then literally map out what you're going to try to do over a 6-week, 6-month, 6-year standpoint, it's pretty easy to just add in an element of conditioning. You can look at aerobic development in a lot of different ways, from that extensive tempo running all the way to long, slow distance. How does that fit the goals in the situation that you have? If you want to work on repeated sprint ability more specifically, through maybe more intensive, you can absolutely do that. How does that fit in? And then how does that fit in with the speed stuff, the weight stuff, and putting all of those pieces kind of on the table and then just fitting them to your specific situation. And that situation is going to change. Every summer might be different. What group of athletes do you have? I don't think it needs to be so rigidly argued one way or the other. Like, there are ways to get better at a lot of different things. You can choose what makes the most sense for your group at that time, given the constraints that you're operating with.
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't get into kind of like testing and assessing or anything else like that. It's certainly considerations around those pieces. I guess where I would like kind of lean us to wrapping up and thinking about is, again, just kind of talking, you just mentioned like your different audiences, your different groups. Let's just put your Coach Brez hat on with your athletes or anything else like that. Is this something that's kind of do on your own when you have time type of stuff in terms of logistics like you mentioned, or doing as a team, working together? Is there kind of pros and cons that you've seen over the history that have benefited one or the other?
Either or. Like, for me, for a long time, it was like I had to be there, everybody had to be there with me because I wanted the team camaraderie, I wanted to organize, run it, etc. But like this summer, just so happens we're faced with a bit more up in the air with new kids amongst a bunch of the staff members, kids graduating and no longer being in the house for older staff members. So we don't necessarily have the exact same ability to commit time for multiple windows and every single day and this, that, and the other. So this summer, it might be more actually what fits our schedule is to say, hey, we're going to be all in with you guys as groups specifically for weightlifting purposes. And then what we're going to ask you to do and be autonomous and be mature about is, because you don't need to get in somewhere, you don't need to be supervised, here is your sprint and speed training, here is your conditioning. So either one is great, and they can be, it's whatever maximizes your use case, which is exactly what you just said. I mean, some summers I would have said, I'm going to be at every single one, you have to be here at this time, this is how we do it.
Yep.
There are other times where I go, look, we want to get all these things done, I can only make it happen for X, Y, and Z. I need you guys to do A, B, and C, and this is how we'll do it.
Yeah, for sure. Nice. I think that just only reason why I asked that question is that, like you said, there is a little bit more freedom because you can get out onto a field, you can do your own thing, whatever it may be, with the sets, reps, intensities, pretty clearly drawn out, especially in the platform program that you just helped kind of to launch and get out. All those different types of pieces are all well and void. Anything else you want to talk about in conditioning, put your stamp on, or is that a pretty good overview of another topic before we...
Yeah, I think that's great. And just a reminder, as you said, that assessment is a second piece, and it's worth a conversation at some point. But just want to make sure that, we at least mention that we know that it exists. But right now, we're just talking about training, not testing of any kind.
Yep, for sure. And obviously, we've spent a lot of time talking about assessments and testing and all of the different pieces along the way. So if it's something that you are curious about or how it gets facilitated, reach out to us as always with questions. As we mentioned, we're going to take a pause here. If you have been listening and following along throughout the school year, we appreciate it. It's a fun exercise for Coach Brez and I and all the different people we bring onto this podcast to continue bringing out the very best content. As we continue into a new school year, new set of challenges, we encourage you to reach out with topics that you want to hear us discuss, big or small. We can send this guy on a mission, Coach Brez, to kind of pedal away on the research train and come ready to talk, and I can pepper him with questions. So thanks again for everybody who has consistently tuned in, or if you're checking it out for the first time, go see some of our other episodes along the way, but we will wrap up as we always do. Thanks again for listening, and remember, at Platform, it's always in pursuit of better.